In one pair of eyes, doom and a brand. In the other, a dangerous truth. Will their silence in the library be the beginning of the end, or the only key to a cage where thorns become a sanctuary and an enemy becomes a final breath? The story starts now. The scent of the Hogwarts library was usually Hermione's sanctuary, a mix of ancient parchment, beeswax, and the comforting weight of centuries of knowledge. But tonight, it felt like a tomb. The candles flickered low, casting long, skeletal shadows against the towering shelves of the restricted section. She shouldn't have been there so late, but she had forgotten her copy of Advanced Rune Translation, and the upcoming newts didn't care about curfew. She moved like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust of the aisles. As she rounded the corner near the back of the section, a faint, rhythmic scratching stopped her heart. It wasn't the sound of a quill. It was the sound of someone breathing, shallow, jagged, and broken. Hermione peered through the gap between two heavy volumes on the history of blood magic. There, bathed in the sickly green glow of a single floating lantern, stood Draco Malfoy. He looked skeletal. The arrogant, sharp lines of his face had been replaced by a haunting gauntness. His expensive wool robes were rumpled, and his tie was undone, hanging limply around his neck. He was leaning against a shelf, his left sleeve pushed up to the elbow. And then she saw it. The skin of his forearm was angry, inflamed, and stained with the pulsating black ink of a serpent coiling through a skull. The dark mark. It wasn't just a tattoo. It looked like a parasite, a living thing that was slowly draining the life from the boy holding it. A small gasp escaped her lips before she could stop it. Draco's head snapped up. In an instant, his sleeve was yanked down, but it was too late. Their eyes locked through the narrow gap of the bookshelf. In that moment, the world outside the library ceased to exist. There were no houses, no war, no blood status. There was only the raw, suffocating electricity of a secret shared. Draco didn't reach for his wand. He didn't sneer. Instead, Hermione saw something she had never seen on a Malfoy. Pure, unadulterated terror. His silver eyes were wide, wet with a shimmer of unshed tears that betrayed his composure. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a gallows, watching the floor drop away. Hermione felt the air leave her lungs. She knew. She had suspected. She had heard Harry's theories. But seeing it, seeing the reality of that brand on the skin of someone she had grown up with, turned her blood to ice. Yet, strangely, she didn't feel the surge of triumph she expected. She felt a sickening wave of pity. He knew she knew. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, vibrating with the things they couldn't say. If he called her a mudblood now, the word would shatter like glass. If she called for a teacher, his life would be over. Neither spoke. Draco took a step back into the shadows, his face hardening into a mask of cold desperation, and Hermione turned and fled, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The next morning, the great hall was a blur of noise and golden light, but for Hermione, everything was muted. She kept her eyes fixed on her porridge, her mind replaying the image of the serpent on Draco's arm. "Look, there's the git now," Ron muttered, nodding toward the entrance. Draco walked in, flanked as always by Blaise Zabini and Pansy Parkinson. He looked like the picture of pure-blood perfection again, but Hermione noticed the tremor in his hands as he reached for a goblet. As they walked past the Gryffindor table, Pansy leaned in, her voice a sharp, ugly needle. Look at the state of Granger. Looks like she spent the night crying over her books. Why don't you tell her what she is, Draco? Give us a laugh." The table went quiet. Harry and Ron tensed, their hands hovering near their wands, waiting for the inevitable slur. Draco stopped. He looked down at Hermione. For a second, that same silver fire she had seen in the library flickered in his gaze. It was a look of profound, agonizing recognition. His mouth opened. The M was right there, the poison ready to be spat. But then his jaw tightened. His throat moved as he swallowed the word down. "Not today, Pansy," he said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual venom. "I have a headache. Let's go." He walked away without looking back. The silence that followed was louder than any insult. Hermione felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, a dangerous, terrifying spark of hope. For the first time in 6 years, Draco Malfoy had chosen silence over cruelty. It was the start of a silent war. Over the next week, the library became their unspoken meeting ground. They never sat together. They never looked directly at one another. But Hermione would find herself choosing a table within his line of sight, and he would stay hours later than he used to, his head buried in books that had nothing to do with his classes. She began to notice the patterns. When he was stressed, he would tap his fingers in a frantic, uneven rhythm. When he thought no one was looking, he would rub his left forearm with a look of such intense loathing that it made her throat ache. One evening, while she was working on a charms essay, a small folded piece of parchment landed on her open textbook. She looked up, but Draco was already walking towards the exit, his cloak billowing behind him. With trembling fingers, she opened it. There were no words, only a beautifully detailed sketch of a small, fragile bird trapped inside a cage made of thorns. She looked at the drawing for a long time. It wasn't an attack. It was a confession. She pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and, with a hand that shook slightly, drew a small silver key resting just outside the thorns. The next day, she tucked the parchment into the book he had been reading, a heavy tome on vanishing cabinets. When he found it, she was watching from behind her own stack of research. She saw him freeze. She saw his fingers trace the lines of the key she had drawn. For a fleeting second, he leaned his forehead against the page, closing his eyes. The repulsion came shortly after. It happened in the corridor after potions. Hermione had tried to catch his eye, perhaps hoping for another moment of silent understanding, but Draco was surrounded by Crabbe and Goyle. He looked cornered. "Granger!" he barked, his voice loud enough for the passing students to hear. "Stop following me around like a lost dog. It's pathetic. Just because I didn't feel like talking the other day doesn't mean you're suddenly worth my time." The words were cold, designed to cut. But Hermione didn't flinch. She saw the way his eyes darted to the dark shadows of the hallway, the way he was playing a part for an audience that was always watching. "I'm not following you, Malfoy," she said calmly, her voice steady. "I'm just walking to class. Perhaps you're the one who is confused about where he's going." He stepped closer, looming over her, his scent, mint and expensive cedarwood, filling her senses. "Stay away from me," he hissed, leaning down so only she could hear. "You have no idea what you're playing with. You're going to get yourself killed trying to be a hero for someone who doesn't want to be saved." The cruelty in his voice was a shield, but but the hand he used to grip the strap of his bag was white-knuckled. "I'm not trying to be a hero, Draco," she whispered back, using his first name for the first time. He flinched as if she had slapped him. The mask slipped for a heartbeat, revealing the boy from the library, the boy who was drowning. Then he sneered, shoved past her, and disappeared into the crowd. The Seesaw had tilted back to cold, but the heat of his whisper stayed with her. Days turned into weeks. The tension between them was like a wire pulled so taut it was humming. Every accidental brush of shoulders in a crowded hallway felt like an electric shock. Every time he didn't call her a name, it felt like a declaration. Hermione found herself staying up late, staring at the Gryffindor fire, wondering why she cared. He was the enemy. He was a Death Eater. He represented everything she was fighting against. And yet, every time she thought of the fear in his eyes, the logic of the war crumbled. She knew she was playing with fire. She knew Harry would be horrified and Ron would be furious. But she couldn't stop. One rainy Tuesday, she found him in the astronomy tower. He was standing at the very edge of the stone railing, the wind whipping his blonde hair across his face. He looked like he was contemplating the drop. "The view is better from the middle," she said softly, stepping out onto the platform. Draco didn't turn around. "I told you to stay away, Granger." "You did. I chose not to listen. You're a stubborn, insufferable witch. And you're a coward who hides behind a mask because you're too afraid to ask for help." He turned then, his eyes burning with a sudden, violent intensity. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, pinning her against the cold stone wall. His hands were on either side of her head, his face inches from hers. "Help?" He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "How can you help me? Can you undo the Dark Lord's mark? Can you protect my mother? Can you make me something other than a monster?" The closeness was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the tiny flecks of grey in his irises. "I can try," she said, her voice barely a breath. Draco's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a second the world stood still. The anger in him seemed to buckle, replaced by a desperate, agonizing hunger. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hitching. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't be kind to me. I can't handle it." He pulled away abruptly, leaving her shivering in the cold mountain air. He vanished down the stairs, the sound of his boots echoing like a heartbeat. The trust was building, brick by painful brick, but the betrayal was always just a breath away. Hermione stayed in the tower long after he left, her hand resting on her heart. She realized then that this wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a tether, and whether she liked it or not, she was tied to the boy with the mark, and the storm was only just beginning. The days that followed the confrontation in the astronomy tower felt like a fever dream. The air in the castle had grown thick with the chill of late autumn, but for Hermione, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of electricity. She saw Draco everywhere, across the great hall, in the shadows of the moving staircases, and always, like a ghost, in the corner of the library. He had become her silent obsession. She found herself documenting his decline in the margins of her notebooks. He was losing weight. The shadows under his eyes had turned a bruised purple, and his movements were becoming increasingly erratic. He was a boy being consumed from the inside out. And the most agonizing part was that she was the only one who seemed to notice the human beneath the monster. Harry was convinced Draco was plotting something, which he was, but Harry saw it as a victory for the dark side. Hermione saw it as a desperate boy trying to keep his head above water in a sea of shadows. One evening, a heavy fog rolled in from the Black Lake, swallowing the grounds and pressing against the stained glass windows of the castle. Hermione was tucked away in her favourite alcove in the library, the one furthest from the heat of the fireplace. She was ostensibly studying for arithmancy, but her eyes kept drifting to the entrance. When he finally appeared, he didn't even have his bag. He looked hollowed out. He didn't look toward her alcove, but he walked straight to the restricted section. Without thinking, Hermione closed her book and followed him. The silence of the restricted section was absolute. Draco was standing in front of a shelf dedicated to dark artifacts, his fingers tracing the spines of the books with a frantic, desperate energy. "You won't find it there," she said softly. Draco jumped, spinning around so fast he nearly knocked over a pedestal. His wand was in his hand before he had even fully turned, the tip glowing with a faint, aggressive white light. When he saw it was her, his shoulders didn't relax. They tightened even further. "Granger," he hissed, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across stone. "I am seconds away from hexing you into the next century. I told you, stay away. You're looking for a way to fix the cabinet, aren't you?" The silence that followed was deafening. Draco's wand hand began to shake. The tip of his wand dipped, the light flickering out. The admission was written in the sudden, sharp intake of his breath. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered. But the lie was so thin, it was transparent. "I've seen you going into the room of requirement," Hermione continued, taking a cautious step forward. She kept her hands visible, palm open, a gesture of peace he didn't seem to know how to interpret. "I've seen you coming out looking like you've been through a war. You're trying to bring them in, aren't you? To save your parents." Draco's face crumpled. The pure blood mask, the Malfoy pride, the centuries of indoctrinated arrogance. It all dissolved in the dim light of the library. He slumped against the bookshelf, his head dropping into his hand. "They'll kill her," he choked out. The sound was raw, a sob he was trying to strangle in his throat. "He told me, if I fail, my mother is first, and then me. But I can't. I can't make it work. Every time I try, the magic it rejects me. Like I'm not dark enough. Like I'm a failure even at being a villain." The approach was instinctive. Hermione moved into his space, her heart breaking for the boy who had spent years making her life miserable. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his shoulder before she finally made contact. The moment her hand touched his robes, Draco let out a shuddering breath. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, a starved man finding a crumb of bread. "You're not a villain, Draco," she whispered. "You're a boy who was given an impossible choice by people who don't deserve your loyalty." For a few minutes, they stood there in the dark, a Gryffindor and a Slytherin, tethered by a secret that could get them both killed. The warmth was palpable. It was a fragile, shimmering thing, a bridge built over an abyss. "Come with me," she breathed. "Let me take you to Dumbledore." He can protect her. He can hide your mother. You don't have to do this." Draco looked up, and for a second she saw a spark of genuine trust in his eyes. He looked at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw, a touch so light it could have been a trick of the wind. "You really believe that, don't you?" he murmured. "You really think the world is that simple?" Then, the repulsion. His expression snapped. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, jagged sneer that looked painful to maintain. He shoved her hand off his arm, his eyes turning to flint. "You're so naive it's sickening, Granger," he spat. He stood up straight, smoothing his robes with trembling hands. "Dumbledore? The man can't even keep a secret in his own school. You think he can hide someone from the Dark Lord? You think I'd trust my mother's life to a senile old man and a girl who thinks a few kind words can erase a blood war?" "Draco, wait!" "No, look at me." He grabbed his left sleeve and yanked it up, exposing the mark. In the dim light, the ink looked blacker than the shadows surrounding them. "This isn't a mistake. This is who I am. I am a Death Eater. I am the son of Lucius Malfoy. And you're just a mudblood who doesn't know when to mind her own business." The slur hit her like a physical blow. After weeks of his silence, hearing the word again felt like a betrayal of everything they had shared in the silence of the library. "There it is," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "The mask. It's easier to be cruel than to be brave, isn't it?" "Get out," he growled, turning his back to her, "before I give you a reason to actually fear me." Hermione didn't wait. She turned and ran, the tears finally breaking free. She hated him. She hated herself for believing there was something worth saving. She hated the way her skin still tingled where he had touched her jaw. The next few days were a blur of cold avoidance. Draco was back to his worst self. He was loud, abrasive, and openly mocking in the corridors. He went out of his way to knock into Neville in the halls and made a public show of laughing at Ron's frayed robes. But Hermione saw the truth. She saw the way his eyes would scan the room for her every time he made a scene. He was performing for her. He was trying to prove to her and to himself that the moment in the library had been a weakness, a fluke. The doubt began to settle in her mind. Was she wrong? Was he truly beyond help? Harry's voice echoed in her head. "He's one of them, Hermione. He chose it." She tried to focus on her classes, but the ink on her parchment seemed to twist into serpents. She stopped going to her usual alcove in the library. She sat in the middle of the Gryffindor common room, surrounded by noise, trying to drown out the memory of his voice. But then came the warmth/cold cycle of the notes. She found the first one tucked into her advanced potion-making book. It wasn't a drawing this time. It was a single line of Latin, Nemo malus felix. No one who is wicked is happy. She stared at it for an hour. It was a confession wrapped in a philosophical quote. He was miserable. She wrote back on the reverse side. Then stop being wicked. She left the book on the table where he usually sat. 2 days later, she found a response. It isn't a choice anymore. The cage is locked, and the key you drew doesn't fit the lock. The intellectual sparring became their new lifeline. They used the books as dead drops. It was a strange, cerebral intimacy. They argued about fate, about blood, about the weight of history. Through the ink, Draco was vulnerable. He was poetic. He was the man she sensed he could be if the world hadn't tried to break him first. But the peace was shattered during a Hogsmeade trip. Harry had been watching Draco on the Marauder's map and followed him into a side alley. When Hermione saw Harry's face as he returned, she knew something had happened. "He's working with Rosmerta," Harry whispered, his face pale with fury. "I saw him, Hermione. He was threatening her. He's using the Imperious Curse." The betrayal hit Hermione like a wave of cold water. While she had been exchanging philosophical notes with him, while she had been dreaming of saving his soul, he had been enslaving an innocent woman to do his dirty work. The next time she saw Draco in the library, she didn't hide in her alcove. She walked straight up to his table and slammed the book, the one containing his last note, down in front of him. He looked up, startled, his eyes wide and searching. "Granger? How could you?" she hissed, her voice low and vibrating with rage. I thought there was a human being in there. I thought you were trapped, but you're using unforgivables on Madame Rosmerta. You're no better than your father." Draco's face went white, then a dark, ugly red. He stood up, towering over her, the chair screeching against the floor. "You don't know anything," he snarled. "You sit in your golden tower with your golden trio and judge the rest of us for doing what we have to do to survive. You think I like it? You think I enjoy the feeling of that curse leaving my wand? There is always a choice, Draco." "Not for me," he roared. A few students at nearby tables looked over, whispering. He lowered his voice, but the intensity didn't fade. "There is no choice for a Malfoy. There is only obedience or death. And if you think your little notes and your keys change that, you're even stupider than I thought." He grabbed his things and stormed out, leaving Hermione standing in the middle of the library, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. The seesaw had swung violently to betrayal/doubt. She felt like a fool. She had let herself care for a boy who was actively working to destroy everything she loved. She went back to her dorm and burned the drawing of the bird in the cage. She watched the parchment curl and blacken, the thorns turning to ash. But as she watched the last spark die out, she realized she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had said, "They'll kill her." The conflict intensified. Her mind was a battlefield between the evidence of his crimes and the evidence of his suffering. She knew what he was doing was wrong, unforgivable even. But she also knew that a boy who was truly evil wouldn't look so haunted. A boy who was truly evil wouldn't have saved a mudblood from an insult in the Great Hall. She was caught in the middle of a war that hadn't even started yet, and the front line was the narrow space between her and the boy she should hate. As December approached, the castle grew even colder. The tension in the school was a physical weight. Draco had stopped coming to the library altogether. He had stopped eating. He was a walking corpse, moving through the halls with a vacant, terrifying stare. Hermione tried to move on. She tried to focus on Harry's plan, on the order, on the impending darkness. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Draco standing at the edge of the astronomy tower, his hair whipping in the wind, looking for a way out that didn't exist. She realized then that the conflict wouldn't be resolved by Dumbledore, or by Harry, or by the war. It would be resolved in the quiet, dark corners where they had first met. It would be resolved by the choice they made when no one was watching. The final shift was coming. The approach was no longer about pity or curiosity. It was about survival for both of them. Because if Draco Malfoy fell into the darkness, Hermione knew a part of her would go with him, lost in the shadows of the library where she had first seen the boy behind the mark. The month of December arrived with a brutal, bone-chilling frost that turned the Black Lake into a sheet of jagged obsidian. Inside the castle, the festive decorations felt like a cruel irony, the bright holly and shimmering tinsel clashing with the oppressive atmosphere of suspicion that had settled over Hogwarts. For Hermione, the world had narrowed down to a singular, agonizing focus. The boy who was no longer appearing in the library. Draco had vanished from his usual haunts. He was missing from meals, and his seat in ancient runes remained empty, a void that seemed to pull at Hermione's concentration until she couldn't distinguish a single glyph on the page. The betrayal/doubt phase had left her raw. But as the days grew shorter and the nights darker, her anger began to dissolve into a terrifying, cold dread. She knew that the silence wasn't a sign of his withdrawal. It was a sign of his desperation. He was running out of time. She found herself wandering the 6th floor, her mind racing through every possible scenario. Had he succeeded? Was the cabinet fixed? Or had he finally crumbled under the weight of the impossible task set by a madman? The conflict within her was no longer about whether he was good or bad. It was about the intrinsic value of a soul pushed to the brink of extinction. It was 2 nights before the winter break when she finally found him. She hadn't been looking in the library or the Great Hall. She had followed a hunch, a memory of the way his eyes always drifted toward the higher levels of the castle when he felt trapped. The room of requirement stood silent in the corridor, but the air around the hidden door felt heavy with warped magic. Hermione didn't try to enter. She knew the room wouldn't let her in while it was occupied by someone with such a specific, desperate purpose. Instead, she waited. She sat on a cold stone bench around the corner, wrapped in her heavy cloak, listening to the silence of the castle. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, the faint sound of a door grinding against stone echoed through the hall. Draco stumbled out. He didn't look like a student anymore. He looked like a casualty. His robes were stained with soot and grease. His hands were bleeding from dozens of small nicks, and his face was a ghostly, translucent white. He didn't see her. He leaned his forehead against the wall, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. Draco. He flinched so violently he nearly fell. He scrambled to reach for his wand, but his fingers were trembling so much he dropped it. The polished hawthorn wood clattered onto the floor, rolling toward Hermione's feet. She didn't pick it up. She didn't move toward him. She simply stayed seated, her heart breaking at the sight of his complete undoing. "Leave me alone," he choked out, his voice cracking. "Please, Granger, just let it end. Go away." "I can't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've tried. I've hated you for weeks. I've told myself you're exactly what Harry thinks you are, but I can't leave you like this." The approach was slow this time, cautious as if she were nearing a wounded animal. Draco watched her, his eyes wide and glazed with exhaustion. He didn't have the energy for a sneer. He didn't have the breath for a slur. "It's done," he whispered, sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the cold floor, his head between his knees. The cabinet. It's almost ready. I've spent months of my life trying to bring death into this school. And I did it. I actually did it. The trust shifted back toward her as he confessed. It was a moment of total vulnerability, a surrender. He wasn't talking to an enemy. He was talking to the only person who had looked at him with anything other than suspicion or expectation for the last year. "You haven't brought them in yet," Hermione said, kneeling on the floor in front of him. The cold of the stones seeped through her robes, but she didn't care. "Draco, listen to me. If you do this, there is no coming back. Not because the world won't let you, but because you won't let yourself. You will never see the boy in the library again." "He's already dead," Draco snapped, lifting his head. His eyes were bloodshot. "He died the moment that ink touched my arm. You're talking about a ghost, Hermione. I'm just the shell left behind." "No," she said firmly, reaching out and grabbing his wrists. His skin was ice cold. "Ghosts don't feel this much pain. Ghosts don't draw keys to cages. You're alive and you're terrified, and that is the most human thing about you." For a heartbeat, the warmth returned. He didn't pull away. He allowed her to hold his wrists, his gaze searching hers for some sign of the lie. But he found only the steady, unwavering heat of her conviction. But then, the repulsion struck like a physical lash. "You think you're so brave," he spat, his voice regaining some of its jagged edge. He yanked his hands back, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just hold my hand and the Dark Lord will disappear? You think your empathy is a weapon? It's a weakness, Granger. It's why you'll lose. You're so busy trying to save everyone that you don't realize some people want to burn." "You don't want to burn," she countered, her voice rising with frustration. "Stop lying to me. You're exhausted from lying to everyone else, so at least be honest with me." "I am being honest," he shouted, the sound echoing through the empty corridor. "I am a coward. I'm doing this because I'm afraid. I'm doing this because I want to live. And if that means you and your friends have to die, then fine. Better you than my mother." The betrayal was sharp. Hermione stood up, looking down at him with a mixture of pity and fury. "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That your mother's life is worth the blood of everyone else in this castle?" "In my world, yes," Draco screamed. He stood up, towering over her, his face inches from hers. "In my world, we protect our own. We don't have the luxury of the greater good. We have blood, and we have duty, and we have the mark." He grabbed his left arm, shaking it at her. "Do you want to see it again? Do you want to see the proof that I belong to him?" "I don't need to see it," Hermione whispered, her voice trembling. "I see you, and that's the problem, isn't it? You hate that I see you." The tension between them was a physical force, a wall of heat and resentment. The cold was absolute. Draco stared at her, his jaw working as he tried to find a word, an insult, anything to bridge the gap and push her away forever. But the word mudblood stayed buried. It was a dead language to him now. "Go to bed, Granger," he finally said, his voice flat and dead. "Before I find a reason to make you regret ever looking at me." He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy and uneven. Hermione watched him go, her hands clenched into fists. The conflict had reached its breaking point. The middle of the story was over. The lines were drawn, and the resolution was no longer a matter of if, But when? The next day, the school was a hive of activity as students prepared to leave for the holidays. Hermione stayed behind. She had told her parents she needed to study, but the truth was, she couldn't leave Draco alone in the castle with that cabinet. She spent the day in the library, but not in her usual spot. She sat in the restricted section, in the exact place where she had first seen the mark. She was looking for something, not a spell, but an answer. She read through journals of former Death Eaters, through histories of the Malfoy family, through anything that could give her a clue on how to break the psychological hold the Dark Lord had on his followers. But the answer wasn't in a book. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks of light across the parchment, she heard a sound, a soft, muffled thud. She looked up. A book had fallen from the shelf 3 aisles over. She walked toward it, her wand ready. Lying on the floor was a copy of The Tales of Beedle the Bard. It was an old, battered copy, clearly not from the library's collection. She picked it up. Tucked inside the cover was a small, folded piece of parchment. She opened it with shaking hands. The Astronomy Tower. Midnight. Don't bring your friends. Don't bring your wand. Just come. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the same elegant, jagged script from the notes. The trust/betrayal seesaw swung one final time. Was it a trap? Was he going to hand her over to the Death Eaters he was bringing in? Was this the moment he finally chose the mark over her? Her mind screamed at her to go to Harry, to go to McGonagall, to tell someone that Draco Malfoy was planning something at midnight. But her heart, the part of her that had seen the bird in the cage and the key outside the thorns, whispered a different name. She spent the evening in a state of paralysis. She watched the clock in the Gryffindor common room, the ticking sounding like a countdown to her own execution. 11 p.m. She checked her bag. 11:30 p.m. She put on her cloak. 11:45 p.m. She climbed through the portrait hole. The castle was silent, the air thick with the smell of old stone and the coming snow. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, her breath visible in the freezing air. She didn't use her wand for light. She let her feet guide her, following the path she had walked 12 times in her mind. As she reached the base of the astronomy tower, she stopped. The wind was howling at the top, a mournful, lonely sound. She took a deep breath, tasting the ice on her tongue, and began the climb. Step by step, the tension increased. Every creak of the wooden stairs felt like a scream. Every shadow felt like a hand reaching out to grab her. But she kept going. When she reached the top, the world opened up. The stars were brilliant, cold diamonds set in a black velvet sky. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face. And there, standing at the very edge, was Draco. He wasn't wearing his robes. He was in a simple black sweater and trousers, looking smaller and more fragile than she had ever seen him. He was looking out over the grounds, his hands resting on the stone railing. "You came," he said, not turning around. His voice was barely audible over the wind. "I said I wouldn't listen to you when you told me to stay away," Hermione replied, walking toward him. She stopped a few feet away, her hands tucked into her pockets. "Why am I here, Draco?" He turned then. In the moonlight, his face was a map of every struggle he had endured this year. The fear was still there, but beneath it, there was something else. A resolve. A finality. "I fixed it," he said. "The cabinet. It's working. They're coming tonight." The repulsion was instantaneous. Hermione took a step back, her hand moving toward where her wand would be, but she had left it behind as requested. "You brought me here to watch, to see your victory." "No," Draco said, taking a step toward her. "I brought you here because you were right, about the key." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a portkey, a tarnished silver snitch that didn't move. "I stole it from Dumbledore's office weeks ago," he whispered. "I've been trying to figure out how to recode it. It's set for a safe house in the south of France. My mother is already there. She left an hour ago. She thinks I'm following her." Hermione stared at the snitch, then at him. The trust flooded back, so overwhelming it made her dizzy. "You're not going with her." "I have to stay. If I don't show up at the cabinet, they'll know something is wrong. They'll hunt her down. I have to be the distraction. I have to be the traitor who died at his post." "No," Hermione said, her voice cracking. "You can't. You'll be killed." "It's a better death than the one I was planning," Draco said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it was the most beautiful and tragic thing she had ever seen. "You told me I wasn't a monster. I want to prove you right, just once." He held out the portkey toward her. "Take it, Hermione. Go with her. Tell her I'm coming, even if it's a lie. Just get out of here before the doors open." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice becoming a sob. She stepped into his space, her hands grabbing his sweater. "I'm not letting you die for a mistake you didn't choose." The warmth was a tidal wave. For the first time, there was no doubt, no repulsion, no cold. There was only the two of them, standing on the edge of a crumbling world, holding onto each other as the storm broke. Draco dropped the portkey. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping away the tears that were freezing on her cheeks. "Why do you care so much?" he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. "I've been so horrible to you. I've called you names. I've mocked you. I've hated you for being everything I wasn't allowed to be." "Because I saw you," she whispered back. "In the library. I saw the boy who was afraid. And I realized I couldn't hate someone who was as broken as I was by this war. The internal monologues of months, the arguments, the notes, the glances, all converged into this single moment. The conflict was resolving not in a battle of wands, but in a battle of hearts. Draco's grip on her face tightened, and for a second the wind seemed to stop. "Hermione," he breathed, her name finally spoken with the reverence it deserved. And then he kissed her. The kiss was not the soft, poetic collision she might have once imagined in a moment of girlhood weakness. It was desperate, jagged, and tasted of salt and the freezing iron of the winter wind. It was the kiss of two people standing on the deck of a sinking ship, reaching for the only thing that felt solid in a world turned to liquid. Draco's hands, usually so poised and cold, were trembling against her cheeks, his fingers tangling into the wild curls at the nape of her neck, as if he were trying to anchor himself to her very soul. Hermione let out a small broken sound against his lips, her own hands clutching the front of his sweater, pulling him closer until there was no space for the air between them. The warmth she had felt in glimpses throughout the year now surged into a blinding inferno. It was the resolution of every silent glance in the library, every unspoken confession in the margins of their books, and every moment he had swallowed a slur in the corridors. When he finally pulled back, only an inch, their breath mingled in a single white cloud in the moonlight. Draco's eyes were no longer the cold, flat silver of a Malfoy coin. They were turbulent and raw. "You have to go," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The cabinet, the resonance is starting. I can feel it in the mark. They'll be here within the hour." "Then we go together," Hermione countered, her voice fierce with a sudden, immovable resolve. She looked down at the silver snitch portkey lying forgotten on the stone floor. "You said it's set for a safe house. We take it. Now." "I told you. I have to be here. If the cabinet opens and no one is there to lead them, they'll know I've turned. They'll track the portkey's signature. They'll find my mother before she can even unpack. I have to stay to buy her time. To buy you time." The repulsion returned, but this time it wasn't Draco pushing her away. It was the sheer weight of his self-sacrifice. He was trying to be a martyr for a cause he didn't believe in, simply to save the people he loved. "No," Hermione said, her mind working at a frantic, brilliant pace. "You're thinking like a Slytherin who has already lost. Think like a Gryffindor for once. We don't just wait for the end. We change the ending." She reached down and snatched up the portkey. "If you stay, you die. If you die, I spend the rest of this war wondering if I could have saved you. Is that what you want for me? To be another ghost in your collection?" Draco flinched, the words cutting through his stoicism. "Hermione, you don't understand the magic involved. The Dark Lord, he'll know." "Let him know," she challenged, stepping closer, her eyes burning with a defiance that made him catch his breath. "Let him know that Draco Malfoy was smarter than him, that you found a key that actually worked." She grabbed his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, forcing him to feel the warmth of her palm against his own. "We go to the safe house. We send word to the Order from there. Dumbledore will know what to do. He can shield the location. We don't have to be the victims of this story, Draco. We can be the ones who walked away." The trust/betrayal seesaw tilted toward a terrifying uncertainty. Draco looked at the dark silhouette of the castle behind them, the place that had been his home and his prison. He looked at the mark on his arm, the brand of his shame. And then he looked at Hermione, the girl who had seen through every mask he had ever worn. "I'm afraid," he confessed, the words so quiet they were almost lost to the wind. "I know," she whispered. "Me too, but we're doing it together." The transition was sudden. Draco's grip on her hand tightened until it was almost painful. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers one last time, his eyes closing as he made the choice. "3," he murmured. "2," she replied. "1." The world vanished into a violent, spinning vortex of silver and blue. The astronomy tower, the cold wind, and the shadow of the wall were replaced by the sickening sensation of being pulled through a needle's eye. They slammed into a hard wooden floor, the air leaving their lungs in a simultaneous gasp. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against a cliffside. Hermione was the first to open her eyes. They were in a small, dimly lit cottage. The air smelled of salt, lavender, and old wood. It was warm, unnervingly warm compared to the frozen heights of Hogwarts. "Draco," a voice whispered from the shadows of a doorway. A woman stepped forward, her blonde hair streaked with silver, her face a mirror of Draco's features, but softened by an agonizing anxiety. Narcissa Malfoy looked at her son, then her gaze drifted to their joined hands, and finally to the girl with the wild hair and Gryffindor colours. "Mother," Draco breathed, pushing himself up from the floor but not letting go of Hermione's hand. Narcissa didn't ask questions. She didn't sneer at Hermione's blood status. She simply crossed the room in a blur of silk and threw her arms around her son, her sobs breaking the silence of the cottage. Over Narcissa's shoulder, Draco met Hermione's eyes. The warmth in that look was absolute. The cold was gone. The repulsion had been conquered. "We're safe," Draco whispered, though it felt more like a question than a statement. "For now," Hermione said, standing up and brushing the dust from her robes. She looked at the two of them, the remnants of a fallen dynasty and the girl who had helped them fall. "But the war is coming here too. We have to be ready." The middle of the night in the south of France was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos they knew was currently erupting at Hogwarts. Hermione walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit ocean. She felt a presence behind her, the familiar scent of mint and cedarwood wrapping around her before he even spoke. Draco stood beside her, his sleeves still pushed up, the dark mark a jarring blemish against the serenity of the room. "It's not over, is it?" he asked, his voice steady now. "No," Hermione replied. "It's just beginning, but for the first time in years, you're on the right side of the line." He turned to her, the moonlight catching the sharp lines of his face, making him look like a statue carved from light. "I don't know how to be good, Hermione. I only know how to be yours." The internal monologue that had plagued Hermione all year, the constant questioning of his motives, the fear of his betrayal, finally fell silent. She didn't need him to be a hero. She just needed him to be the man who chose the secret in the library over the mark on his arm. She reached out, her fingers tracing the ink on his skin. "That's a start," she whispered. Draco leaned in, his lips finding hers again, but this time the kiss was different. It wasn't a desperate anchor. It was a promise. It was slow, lingering, and tasted of a future that they would have to fight every day to keep. The emotional seesaw had finally found its balance. In the quiet of the cottage, far from the reach of the Dark Lord and the expectations of their blood, Draco Malfoy did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He let go of the tension in his shoulders. He let go of the fear. "Hermione," he said, the name a soft weight on his tongue. "Yes, Draco? Thank you for not staying away." She smiled, a small, knowing thing. "I told you, I'm an insufferable, stubborn witch. The best kind," he murmured, pulling her back into the circle of his arms. Outside, the waves continued to crash against the shore, a relentless reminder of the world's chaos. But inside, between a girl who knew too much and a boy who had lost everything, there was a peace that the war could never touch. They were the keepers of each other's secrets, the architects of their own escape, and for the first time in their lives, they were exactly where they were meant to be. The mark was still there, a permanent scar of a past he couldn't erase. But as Hermione rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. She knew that the mark no longer defined him. He was not a Death Eater, a traitor, or a coward. He was simply Draco, the boy who had found his way out of the thorns because a girl had been brave enough to draw him a key. And as the first light of dawn began to grey the horizon, they stood together, watching the sun rise on a world that was broken, but a life that was finally, truly their own. The first week at the safe house felt like a phantom existence. The cottage, tucked into a jagged limestone cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, was a place of surreal beauty that neither of them felt they deserved. The air was thick with the scent of wild rosemary and the sharp salt spray of the sea, a world away from the damp stone and sulphurous tension of Hogwarts. Yet, for Draco, the silence was louder than any explosion. It was the silence of a life stripped of its purpose, its pedigree, and its protection. He spent the first 3 days sitting on the stone terrace, staring at the horizon with a vacant intensity. He was waiting for the sky to turn black, for the screech of owls bearing death sentences, or for the sudden, searing agony of the mark that would signal his final summons. It didn't come. Instead, there was only the sun, relentless and mocking, and the quiet presence of the girl who had ruined his life by saving it. Hermione watched him from the kitchen window, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The approach was now a delicate domestic dance. She wanted to reach out, to pull him back from the edge of his own mind, but she could feel the repulsion radiating off him like heat from a dying fire. He was ashamed. In the library, they had been equals in a secret. Here, in the harsh light of a French morning, he was a refugee, and she was his architect. "You should eat something," she said, stepping out onto the terrace. She didn't move too close. She had learned the boundaries of his shadows. Draco didn't turn. His profile was sharp against the blue sky, his pale skin beginning to redden under the unaccustomed sun. "I'm not hungry, Granger." "You haven't been Granger to me for a while now, Draco," she said softly, leaning against the railing. He finally looked at her, and the trust she had seen in the astronomy tower was gone, replaced by a jagged, defensive doubt. He looked at her clean Gryffindor sweater, her wild hair pinned back, her eyes bright with a future she still believed in. Then he looked at himself, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes hollow, his left arm a constant, throbbing reminder of his failure. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice rough. The warmth of the tower, was that just the adrenaline? Or do you actually think there's a place for me in the world you're trying to build? "There is a place for anyone who chooses to stand in the light," she replied, her voice steady. "Don't give me your Dumbledore platitudes," he snapped, standing up so abruptly his chair screeched against the stone. The cold slammed between them. "I am a branded murderer in waiting. I brought the enemy to the gates of your home. Your friends, Potter, Weasley, they would have me in Azkaban before I could even finish a sentence. You're keeping a pet, Hermione, a dangerous, broken pet." The repulsion was physical. He turned to walk back into the house, but Hermione stepped into his path. She didn't touch him, but she stood her ground, her jaw set in that stubborn line he had come to both hate and crave. "I am not keeping a pet," she hissed. "I am keeping a promise. I saw the boy in the library, Draco. I saw him crying. I saw him drawing birds in cages. If you want to believe that boy was a lie, then go ahead. Walk out. The port key is on the table. But don't you dare insult me by saying I don't know who I'm standing next to." They stood in a stalemate of breathing and resentment. The emotional seesaw was at its lowest point, the weight of their pasts pulling them toward the earth. Draco's hands were clenched at his sides, his breath hitching in his chest. He wanted to scream at her, to push her away, to be the villain he had been trained to be. But when he looked into her eyes, he didn't see judgment. He saw a mirror. He saw someone who was also terrified, also scarred, and also refusing to give up. The trust flickered back, fragile and bright. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders finally dropping. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to just be." "Neither do I," she admitted, her voice softening. "But we start with breakfast, and then we figure out how to contact the Order." The next few days brought a tentative warmth. They began to work together to secure the cottage. Narcissa remained in a state of fragile recovery, spending most of her time in the gardens, her hands constantly moving, as if she was still clutching a wand she no longer trusted. This left Draco and Hermione to navigate the space between them. They began to talk, truly talk, for the first time without the threat of the restricted section or the wind of the astronomy tower. They talked about the things they missed, the way the Great Hall smelled during the first frost, the specific blue of the Ravenclaw tapestries, the quiet of the owlery. Draco confessed his love for the complex geometry of arithmancy. Hermione told him about her childhood in the Muggle world, of dentists and libraries that didn't have a restricted section. But the betrayal/doubt was always lurking. It came in the form of a newspaper. Narcissa had managed to procure a copy of Le Cri du Sorcier, the French wizarding daily. The headline was a jagged scar across the front page. "Hogwarts fallen? Dumbledore missing in clash." Hermione felt the world tilt. She grabbed the paper, her eyes skimming the blurred text. Reports of Death Eaters in the corridors. Reports of a green spark over the astronomy tower. Reports of a student traitor who had vanished before the final blow was struck. She looked at Draco. He was standing by the fireplace, his face turning a sickly, translucent white. He had seen the headline. "They think I did it," he whispered. "They think I killed him." "We don't know what happened, Draco," Hermione said, her voice trembling. "The report is vague. It says missing, not dead." "It doesn't matter," he cried, the cold returning with a vengeance. He began to pace the small living room like a caged animal. "The Order will think I led him into a trap. Harry will think I murdered his mentor. And my side will think I'm a coward who ran before the job was done. There is no right side for me, Hermione. I'm a ghost on both ends of the spectrum." "We have to send a message," she said, trying to remain the voice of logic. "We have to tell them where we are, what happened." "No," Draco roared, turning on her. The repulsion was back, fueled by his self-loathing. "You want to lead them here? You want to bring the war to this cottage? You've done enough, Granger. You've played your little game of save the Slytherin, but the game is over. The world is burning, and you're stuck with the man who lit the fuse." The betrayal stung. Hermione dropped the newspaper, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "Is that all this was to you? A game? You think I risked my life, my reputation, and my family for a game? I think you're a girl who can't stand a puzzle she can't solve, Draco spat. And I was the ultimate puzzle, wasn't I? The bad boy with a secret, the Death Eater with a soul. Well, congratulations, you solved it. Now look at the mess you've made. He stormed out of the cottage, headed for the cliffs. Hermione didn't follow him this time. She sat on the floor, the French newspaper crumpled in her hands, and felt the crushing weight of the doubt she had been trying to outrun. Had she made a mistake? Had her empathy blinded her to the reality of the war? She spent the afternoon in a state of frozen grief. She thought of Harry and Ron, of the battle they must have fought, of the fear they must have felt when they couldn't find her. She felt like a traitor to her own blood, a girl who had abandoned her post for a boy who couldn't even stand the sight of her when things got difficult. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sea in shades of bruised purple and gold, a movement caught her eye. Draco was returning, but he wasn't walking with his usual arrogant stride or his defeated slouch. He was walking slowly, his head down, clutching something in his hand. He entered the cottage and stopped. Hermione was still sitting on the floor, the room shrouded in twilight. He didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Finally, he knelt down in front of her. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough that she could feel the cold air clinging to his clothes. "I went to the village," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "To the wizarding apothecary. I used the last of the gold my mother had hidden." He opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a small, ornate vial. It was Veritaserum. "Ask me," he said. "Ask me anything. Ask me if I wanted to kill him. Ask me if I regret leaving. Ask me if I'm using you." The trust that flooded through her was so intense, it was painful. She looked at the vial, then at his face. He was offering her the only thing he had left, his absolute, undeniable truth. It was the ultimate approach. "I don't need the potion, Draco," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You do," he insisted, a tear finally escaping his eye and tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "Because I don't trust myself. I don't know if I'm a good man. But I know that when I'm with you, I want to be. And I need you to know that the things I said, the things I called you, they were the last gasps of a man who is terrified of being loved by someone he doesn't deserve." He uncorked the vial and tipped 3 drops onto his tongue before she could stop him. His eyes glazed over for a moment, the potion taking hold of his nervous system, stripping away his ability to deceive. "Do you love me?" she whispered, the question escaping her before she could think to be safe. Draco's breath hitched. The truth forced its way up his throat, bypassing his pride and his fear. "With every broken part of me," he said, his voice hollow but certain. "I loved you in the library when I couldn't say your name. I loved you in the tower when I thought I was dying. And I love you now, even though I am nothing. Do you regret leaving?" "No," he said instantly. "My only regret is that I didn't leave sooner. My only regret is every day I spent pretending I was better than you because of my blood." Hermione reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed the hair from his forehead. The warmth was back, but it wasn't the frantic heat of the astronomy tower. It was a slow, steady burn, like the embers of a fire that had finally found its hearth. "I love you too," she whispered. The potion didn't care about her confession, but Draco did. The glazed look in his eyes shattered, replaced by a raw, overwhelming clarity. He leaned forward, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his body shaking with the force of his relief. "We're going to be okay," she murmured, holding him as he finally, truly broke. "We'll find them. We'll help them. But we're doing it together." The emotional seesaw had stilled. There was no more repulsion, no more cold, no more doubt. There was only the truth, stripped bare by a potion and a girl who refused to look away. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. "They're going to come for us, Hermione. Voldemort doesn't let go of his toys." "Let them come," she said, a fierce spark returning to her gaze. "They'll find a Gryffindor and a Malfoy who have nothing left to lose. And that is a very dangerous combination." Draco leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was no longer an anchor or a promise, but a declaration. It was deep, tasting of the salt of his tears and the iron of their shared resolve. In the fading light of the French coast, they weren't students or soldiers or enemies. They were two people who had found a secret in a library and had built a world out of the silence that followed. And as the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, mirroring the diamonds they had seen on the tower, Draco Malfoy finally spoke her name again. Not as a slur, not as a challenge, but as a prayer. "Hermione, I'm here, Draco. I'm not going anywhere." The war was still out there, raging across the channel, but in that small cottage by the sea, the first victory had already been won. The cage was empty, the thorns were cleared, and the key had finally found its lock. The following weeks were a slow reconstruction of two souls that had been dismantled by expectation and war. They lived in the quiet pulse of the French coastline, where the days were marked by the shifting tides and the arrival of news that grew increasingly grim. The warmth they had found in the truth-telling of the Veritaserum had settled into a steady, protective shield, but it was tested daily by the sheer weight of their isolation. Hermione had finally managed to send a Patronus. It was a risk, a shimmering silver otter that streaked across the dark expanse of the Mediterranean toward a contact she hoped was still alive. Until an answer came, they were suspended in a liminal space, too traitorous for one side, too suspicious for the other. This suspension bred a new kind of emotional seesaw, the trust versus the ghost of identity. One afternoon, while the sun baked the limestone terrace into a pale, blinding white, Hermione found Draco in the small study at the back of the cottage. He was surrounded by ancient, crumbling ledgers he had found in the cellar. He was meticulously transcribing something, his brow furrowed in a way that made him look like the boy she used to watch across the great hall. "What is it?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Draco didn't look up, but he didn't tense either. A small victory in the approach they practiced every hour. "My family has properties all over Europe, Hermione. Most are warded with blood magic so ancient it's practically sentient. If the Order needs places to move people, to hide, I can give them the keys. But..." He stopped, his quill hovering over the parchment. The cold seeped back into his voice. "To unlock them, I have to use the very thing I'm trying to forget. I have to claim the Malfoy name. I have to act like the lord of a manor I never wanted." "You're using the darkness to serve the light, Draco," she said, moving into the room. "That's not a betrayal of who you are now. It's a redemption of who you were born to be." He looked at her then, and the doubt was visible in the way he gripped the quill. Is it? Or is it just a different kind of leash? Every time I touch this magic, I feel the mark pulse. It's like it knows I'm trying to repurpose it. It feels like I'm dragging you into the mud with me. The repulsion was internal this time. He shoved the ledger away, standing up and pacing the small room. "You should be with them, Hermione. You should be in a tent somewhere with Potter and Weasley, planning a revolution. Instead, you're here, helping a Death Eater organize his real estate." "Stop it," she said, her voice sharp. "Stop trying to push me away by devaluing what we're doing. You are providing a sanctuary. That is as much a part of the war as any hex." "It doesn't feel like it," he roared, his voice cracking. "It feels like hiding. It feels like I'm waiting for the inevitable moment when your world realizes I'm not worth the trouble of saving." The betrayal/doubt cycle was spinning again. He was terrified that her love was a temporary mercy, a symptom of the crisis rather than a permanent state. He looked at her with a raw, agonizing hunger for reassurance, yet his pride forced him to lash out before she could reject him first. "You think I'm that shallow?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous low vibrato. "You think after everything, the library, the tower, the Veritaserum, that I'm just waiting for a better option?" "I think you're a hero," he spat, though the words sounded like a confession of love. "And heroes eventually grow tired of the villains they've rescued. They want someone who doesn't have a snake burned into their skin." He turned to leave, but Hermione grabbed his arm, the left one. She didn't flinch. She pulled him toward her, her eyes blazing with a fierce Gryffindor fire that silenced his protest. "This," she said, her fingers digging into the fabric of his sleeve where the mark lay hidden. "This is a scar. It's a record of where you've been. But it doesn't tell me where you're going. I am not a hero looking for a project, Draco. I am a woman who found the only person in the world who understands what it's like to be crushed by the weight of a war we didn't start." The approach was a collision. She pulled him down into a kiss that was meant to shatter his defenses, to punish his doubt, and to remind him of the warmth that was their only true currency. Draco resisted for a heartbeat, his body stiff with the remnants of his Malfoy armor, and then he broke. He pulled her into him, his hands sliding up to cup her face, his kiss desperate and apologetic. "I'm sorry," he breathed against her lips, the repulsion dissolving into a total, terrifying trust. "I'm so sorry. I don't know why I keep trying to ruin this." "Because you're waiting for the other shoe to drop," she whispered, her forehead resting against his. "But there is no other shoe, Draco. There's just us, and the sea, and whatever comes next." They spent the rest of the afternoon in a fragile, beautiful warmth. They finished the list of safe houses. They talked about the future as if it were a real thing, a place they could actually reach. They spoke of a world where they could walk through the streets of London and not look for shadows. But as the sun began to set, the cold returned in a way they couldn't ignore. A silver light flared in the center of the room. It wasn't Hermione's otter. It was a stag, regal, shimmering, and bearing a voice that made Hermione's heart stop. "Hermione, we got your message. We're alive. We're in hiding. If you're with him, if he's really turned, we need you. Both of you. The final move is starting. Meet us at the coordinates in 2 days. Trust no one else." The Patronus vanished, leaving the room in a sudden, suffocating darkness. The emotional Seesaw swung violently. "Harry," she whispered, her hand going to her mouth. Draco was standing by the window, his face a mask of pale terror. The doubt was back, but this time it wasn't about her. It was about the world. "He wants me there. He wants the Death Eater in the room. He wants the man I told him you are," Hermione corrected, though her own heart was hammering. "He needs the safe houses, Draco. He needs the information you have." "And what happens when the battle starts?" Draco asked, turning to her. The repulsion was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical realism. "What happens when I'm standing across from people I've known my whole life? What happens when I see my father?" The conflict intensified. The middle of the story was closing, and the stakes were no longer just their survival, but the survival of their world. Each scene had led to this. The silent pact in the library was now a public commitment to a cause that would likely see them both dead. "We go," Hermione said, her voice shaking but certain. "We go because we can't stay in this cottage forever, pretending the world isn't ending. We go because I won't let them fight without us." "And if they kill me the moment I arrive?" Draco asked. "Then they'll have to kill me too," she replied. The night before their departure was a sleepless vigil. They sat on the terrace, watching the moon reflect off the water. The warmth was tinged with a tragic cold. The realization that this might be the last time they were ever truly alone, ever truly safe. Draco reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the lines of her palm. "In the library," he started, his voice low and melodic. "That first night, I thought you were going to call for the prefects. I thought my life was over the second our eyes met." "I thought about it," she admitted, "for a split second, but then I saw your face. You looked so small, like a child who had realized the dark was real." "I was," he said. "I was terrified. But when you didn't say anything, when you just looked at me, it was the first time in my life I felt like I was something other than a Malfoy. I was just a boy being seen by a girl." He leaned in, his lips grazing her ear. "If we don't make it back from this, if the end isn't what we hoped for, I want you to know that those seconds in the library were the most important of my life. Because they led me to you." The emotional Seesaw reached a point of perfect heartbreaking balance. The approach, the repulsion, the trust, and the doubt had all been refined into a single, crystalline moment of clarity. "We're going to make it," Hermione whispered, though she knew she was lying. "We have to." She turned in his arms, her hands finding the back of his neck, pulling him down into a kiss that tasted of salt, rosemary, and the impending end of the world. It was a kiss of trust in the face of betrayal, of warmth in the heart of cold. When they finally broke apart, the first grey light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon. The 2 days were up. The cottage by the sea was no longer a sanctuary, it was a starting line. "Ready?" she asked, her wand in her hand. Draco looked at the mark on his arm, then at her. He didn't hide the brand this time. He just nodded, his silver eyes hard and bright. "Ready." They stepped off the terrace and into the swirling vortex of the unknown, leaving the peace of France behind for the fire of England. The secret they had shared in the library was about to become the light they would use to burn the world down and build it anew. The transition was violent, the air screaming around them as they disapparated. When they landed, it wasn't on a beach or a cliffside. It was in the middle of a forest, the air thick with the smell of pine and the static of protective enchantments. "Halt!" a voice barked. Hermione stood tall, her hand firmly in Draco's. She could feel him trembling, but he didn't pull away. He didn't sneer. He just stood by her side, the Death Eater who had chosen a girl over a king. "It's me," Hermione called out, her voice ringing through the trees. "It's Hermione, and I've brought the key." The shadows moved, and for the first time in months the golden trio was almost whole again. But this time the gold was streaked with silver. The transition back to England was like being plunged into a vat of ice water. The air in the Forest of Dean was damp, heavy, and tasted of rot and ancient magic. The silence here wasn't the peaceful, rhythmic quiet of the French coast. It was a predatory silence, the kind that preceded a strike. As the protective enchantments rippled like silk against her skin, Hermione felt Draco's hand tighten around hers, so hard his knuckles went white. He was a soldier returning to a battlefield where he had already been declared a casualty. "Identify yourselves." The voice was Ron's. It was deeper, rougher, and lacked the playful lilt she had known for years. From the thicket of oak and pine, two figures emerged. Harry looked as if he had aged a decade. His face was gaunted, his glasses cracked, and his eyes bore the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too many friends fall. Ron stood beside him, his wand levelled directly at Draco's throat, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. The repulsion was instantaneous and external. It wasn't Draco pushing Hermione away this time. It was her own world pushing back against the choice she had made. "Lower your wand, Ron," Hermione said, her voice steady despite the frantic thudding of her heart. She stepped slightly in front of Draco, a movement that didn't escape Harry's sharp gaze. "He's a Death Eater, Hermione!" Ron spat, his wand hand shaking with fury. "He's the reason the school fell. He's the reason Dumbledore is—" "I know what he is," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the damp air like a blade. "I also know what he's done. He's saved his mother. He's provided us with the locations of every Malfoy safe house in Europe. And he's here, without a wand, standing in front of you." Draco remained silent. This was the cold in its most crystalline form. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't sneer. He simply stood there, his silver eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Ron's shoulder. He looked exactly like the boy in the library, hollowed out, waiting for the floor to drop. "Is it true?" Harry asked, his voice low. He wasn't looking at Hermione. He was looking at Draco. "The safe houses, the cabinet. You're really out?" "I was never in," Draco said, his voice a ghost of its former arrogance. "I was a hostage. Now I'm just a traitor. If you want to kill me, Weasley, do it quickly. I'm tired of waiting for the end." The trust/betrayal seesaw was at a terrifying equilibrium. Harry stepped forward, his eyes searching Draco's face with the intensity of a legilimens. Hermione held her breath. She knew that if Harry rejected him, Draco would vanish into the woods and never be seen again. He would choose the cold over the risk of being hurt by her world one more time. He stays, Harry finally said. Harry, you can't be serious, Ron roared. He stays, Harry repeated, firmer this time. If Hermione trusts him, I trust her. And we need those houses, Ron. We're being hunted like animals. They moved into the small, cramped tent. The interior was a chaotic mess of maps, half-eaten tins of food, and the heavy metallic scent of healing potions. The warmth of the reunion was strangled by the presence of the enemy in the room. Hermione felt the emotional seesaw shifting beneath her feet. She was home, but she had brought the secret with her, and it felt like a heavy, jagged stone in the middle of their circle. For the first few hours, Draco sat in the furthest corner of the tent, his back to the wall, watching the trio with a wary, animal-like suspicion. He was the approach that had stalled. I can't believe you're with him, Ron whispered to Hermione while they were preparing a meagre stew near the entrance. After everything he called you, after what his family represents. He isn't his family, Ron, she replied, her eyes drifting toward the corner where Draco sat. He was staring at the dark mark on his arm, his thumb tracing the ink with a look of such visceral disgust that it made her chest ache. He's just a boy who was given a choice between being a murderer or a victim. He chose neither. He chose to run. He chose you, Ron countered, his voice bitter. And I chose him. The night was a series of tense, whispered conferences. Harry laid out the plan. They needed to infiltrate a series of vaults and manors to find the remaining Horcruxes. Draco provided the technical details, the wards, the guard rotations, the ancient bloodlocks that only a Malfoy could bypass. He spoke with a cold, clinical efficiency, but every time he mentioned a name, Bellatrix, Lucius, Greyback, his voice would hitch, a tiny fracture in his mask. Around 3 a.m., the Repulsion struck again. Harry and Ron had fallen into a fitful sleep. Hermione walked over to Draco, offering him a piece of bread. He looked at it, then at her, and his eyes were full of a sudden, violent doubt. You shouldn't be near me, he whispered. Look at them. They hate me, and they're right to. Every second you spend defending me, you lose a piece of their respect. You're destroying your life for a shadow, Hermione. My life was destroyed the moment the war started, Draco, she said, sitting on the floor beside him. The only thing I've built since then is this, is us. There is no us in a war, he hissed, his face inches from hers. The cold was back, fueled by his fear of ruining her. There is only survival. When the Death Eaters find us, and they will, they'll target you first because you're with me. They'll make you pay for my betrayal. Go back to them, sleep in their corner, pretend I'm just a prisoner you're interrogating. I won't do that. Why are you so stubborn? He groaned, leaning his head back against the canvas of the tent. I am trying to save you from myself. And I am telling you that I don't want to be saved, she whispered, reaching out to take his hand. He flinched, his fingers curling away, but she didn't let go. She interlaced her fingers with his, forcing him to acknowledge the warmth that was still there, even in the middle of a dark forest in a dying world. I know what's coming. I know it's going to be horrible, but I'd rather face it with you than spend another minute wondering if you're alive. The trust returned, slow and agonizing. Draco's grip on her hand tightened, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. I saw my father in a vision today, he confessed, his voice trembling. "Through the mark. He's being punished for my disappearance. They're torturing him, Hermione. And he's screaming my name." The betrayal/doubt cycle was no longer about their relationship. It was about the cost of his soul. He was a son who had abandoned his father to save himself and a girl. The guilt was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that threatened to crush the fragile peace they had built. "He would have let you die for his cause," Hermione reminded him gently. "I know, but he's still my father." The conflict intensified. The emotional seesaw was no longer a game of approach and repulsion. It was a battle between loyalty to blood and loyalty to the heart. Hermione watched him, realizing that the happy ending they had dreamed of in France was being paid for in the currency of Draco's sanity. The next morning, the final shift began. The forest was suddenly filled with the sound of snapping twigs and the low, guttural growls of snatchers. The protective enchantments were being picked at, the air shimmering with the heat of dark magic. "They found us!" Ron yelled, grabbing his bag. "Pack the tent! Draco, stay with Hermione!" Harry commanded. Chaos erupted. Red and green sparks flew through the trees, shattering the trunks and setting the dry needles ablaze. Hermione felt Draco's arm wrap around her waist, pulling her behind a large oak. He didn't have a wand, but he was using his body as a shield, his eyes scanning the tree line with the frantic intensity of a cornered wolf. "Granger, look out!" A snatcher lunged from the shadows, his face twisted in a grin. Hermione raised her wand, but she was half a second too slow. Draco didn't hesitate. He dived forward, tackling the man to the ground with a raw, primal roar. They rolled in the dirt, Draco using his fists and his weight to pin the man down, his face a mask of desperate fury. "Stupefy!" Hermione cried, hitting the snatcher as soon as she had a clear shot. Draco scrambled back to her, his lip bleeding, his chest heaving. For a moment, he looked at the unconscious man on the ground, then at his own hands. He had fought. He had defended a mudblood against one of his own kind. The warmth that passed between them in that moment was visceral. It was the trust of two people who had finally, irrevocably chosen their side. "We have to go! Now!" Harry shouted, grabbing Hermione's arm. They gathered in a circle, their hands locking. Hermione reached for Draco, her fingers sliding into his. He looked at her, and in the middle of the fire and the screaming and the smell of ozone, he gave her a small, certain nod. The world twisted. The forest vanished. When they landed, they were on a wind-swept cliffside, the ocean roaring below them. It was Shell Cottage, the place Bill and Fleur had turned into a refuge. They collapsed into the sand, the adrenaline slowly draining away. Harry and Ron moved toward the house, but Hermione and Draco stayed on the dunes, the wind whipping their hair. "You're bleeding," she said, reaching up to touch his lip. Draco caught her hand, kissing her palm. The emotional seesaw had stilled. The repulsion was gone. The doubt had been burned away in the forest fire. There was only the approach that had finally reached its destination. "I'm okay," he whispered. "I'm here." "You fought for us," she said. "I fought for you," he corrected. "I'll always fight for you." They sat together in the sand, watching the grey Atlantic waves crash against the rocks. The war was far from over. There would be more battles, more losses, and the final confrontation at Hogwarts was looming like a dark mountain on the horizon. But as Hermione rested her head on Draco's shoulder, she felt a peace she hadn't known since the library in the 6th year. The secret was no longer a burden. It was their foundation. Draco. Yes? When this is over, when the war is finally gone, where do you want to go? He looked out at the water, his silver eyes reflecting the cold light of the morning. Somewhere with a library, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. But this time, I want it to be our library. No restricted section, no shadows, just us. I'd like that, she whispered. He turned to her then, his hand framing her face, his thumb stroking the curve of her cheek. The warmth was absolute, a heat that could withstand any winter. He leaned in, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was no longer a desperate plea or a tragic goodbye. It was a homecoming. It was slow, deep, and tasted of the future. Hermione closed her eyes, letting the sound of the ocean and the heat of his breath fill her. In this moment, they weren't Gryffindor or Slytherin. They weren't a hero and a traitor. They were just two people who had found a way to love each other in the dark and who were finally stepping into the light. But as they pulled apart, Draco's gaze drifted to the north, toward the distant silhouette of the Highlands. We have to go back, don't we? He asked, his voice losing its softness. To the school, to the library where it started. Yes, Hermione said, her voice hardening with resolve. We have to finish it. Then let's finish it, he said, standing up and pulling her with him. But this time, I'm not hiding in the shadows. I'm standing next to you. They walked toward the cottage, their fingers interlaced, two shadows against the rising sun, ready to face the end of the world together. The air in the great hall of Hogwarts was thick with the scent of ozone, ancient dust, and the metallic tang of blood. The war had finally returned to the place where their secret had first been forged, between the shelves of the library. It was the final hour. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, illuminated by the relentless barrage of spells hitting the protective dome of the castle. Inside, the world was fracturing. Hermione stood in the center of the chaos, her wand raised, her breath coming in jagged hitches. Beside her, Draco Malfoy was a study in silver and shadow. He had no wand. He had given his to Harry weeks ago, but he held a dagger of goblin-wrought silver, and his presence was a shield more solid than any Protego. The emotional Seesaw was at its most violent peak. They were surrounded by people who had spent years hating them, and now, in the face of death, that hate was turning into a desperate, confused reliance. "They're through the gates!" a voice screamed from the entrance. The repulsion was no longer between Draco and Hermione, but between them and the world they were trying to save. As the Death Eaters breached the hall, Draco saw faces he recognized. Aunts, uncles, former family friends. For a second, his body went rigid. The cold of his upbringing threatened to paralyze him. "Draco," Hermione whispered, her hand finding the crook of his elbow for a fleeting second. The touch was the approach he needed. It anchored him. He turned to her, and for a heartbeat, the war vanished. There was only the girl who had seen him in the dark, and the boy who had chosen to step into the light. "I'm here," he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl of resolve. "I'm not going back." The battle was a blur of light and screams. Hermione moved with a lethal, calculated grace, her mind a whirlwind of spells she had mastered in the quiet hours of her youth. Every time a curse came too close, Draco was there, pulling her down, shielding her with his body, his eyes scanning the crowd for the one man he truly feared. And then, the betrayal/doubt reached its final agonizing climax. Lucius Malfoy stepped through the rubble of the main doors. He looked like a spectre of his former self, his hair matted, his eyes wild with a mixture of terror and fanaticism. He locked eyes with his son, and the silence that fell between them was louder than the crashing of the stones above. "Draco," Lucius hissed, his voice carrying through the din. "Come here, now. The Dark Lord is merciful to those who return. Don't let this girl lead you to your grave." Hermione felt the air leave her lungs. This was the moment, the ultimate repulsion. Draco was being offered a way back to the only life he had ever known, a life of safety, status, and family. She looked at him, her heart breaking in advance, waiting for the doubt to take hold. Draco took a step forward. His face was a mask of cold marble. He looked at his father, then he looked at the mark on his own arm, the ink that was currently burning with the proximity of his master. "You're right, Father," Draco said, his voice echoing through the hall. "She did lead me." He reached back and took Hermione's hand, pulling her forward until she stood level with him. He interlaced their fingers, his grip so tight it was a vow. "She led me to myself," Draco said, his silver eyes turning to flint. "You offered me a cage and called it a kingdom. She offered me a secret and called it a life. I am not a Malfoy. I am just a man who loves her. And if that is my grave, then I will lie in it gladly." The warmth that flooded Hermione's chest was so intense it felt like magic itself. The emotional seesaw had finally, irrevocably shattered. There was no more repulsion. There was no more doubt. There was only the absolute, blinding trust of two souls that had found their home. Lucius let out a strangled cry of rage and raised his wand. But before the curse could leave his lips, a blast of red light hit him from the side. Ron and Harry had emerged from the shadows, their wands leveled. "Stay away from them," Ron yelled, his voice cracking but firm. The final surge of the battle was a whirlwind. When the dust finally settled, when the Dark Lord's scream had echoed its last, and the sun began to peek over the charred remains of the astronomy tower, the silence that followed was heavy and holy. Hermione and Draco were slumped against the base of the Gryffindor table. They were covered in soot, their clothes torn, their bodies aching with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. But they were alive. The approach was now a permanent state. Draco pulled her into his side, his chin resting on the top of her head. For the first time since the library in the 6th year, the cold was gone. The shadows had been burned away by the rising sun. "We did it," she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. "No," Draco said, pulling back to look at her. His silver eyes were bright with tears he didn't try to hide. "You did it. You saved a boy who didn't want to be saved. You drew a key for a bird that didn't think it could fly." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her lip, clearing away a smudge of dirt. The warmth between them was no longer a flicker. It was a sun. "I love you, Hermione Granger," he said. It wasn't a whisper in a library or a desperate confession in a tower. It was a clear, ringing truth in the light of a new world. I love you, Draco Malfoy, she replied. He leaned in, and this time the kiss was the end and the beginning, all at once. It was slow, deep, and tasted of victory and peace. It was the resolution of every conflict, the answer to every question they had asked in the margins of their books. As his lips met hers, Hermione felt the last of the tension leave her body. The emotional seesaw was still. They were balanced. They pulled apart, but Draco didn't let go. He leaned his forehead against hers, his breath hitching. What now? Now, Hermione said, looking around at the ruins of the school that had shaped them. We build that library, the one with no shadows. And no restricted section, he added, a genuine, beautiful smile breaking across his face. They stood up together, their hands still locked. As they walked out of the great hall, past the friends who were still learning how to look at them, and into the cool, fresh air of the morning, the world felt vast and full of possibility. The dark mark on Draco's arm would always be there, a fading scar of a war that was over. But as he looked at the girl walking beside him, the girl who had known his secret and kept it, he knew that the ink no longer held any power. He was not a Death Eater. He was not a traitor. He was a man who had been found in a library and had never been lost again. The story that had begun with a silent look over a bookshelf ended with a quiet walk into the sun. The conflict was resolved, the development was complete, and as they reached the edge of the lake, Draco stopped her. He turned her to face him, his hands sliding down to her waist. The approach was total. He kissed her again, a long, lingering kiss that spoke of years of quiet mornings and peaceful nights yet to come. My secret, he whispered against her lips. My mark, she replied, her hands tangling in his blonde hair. In the heart of the wreckage, they had found a masterpiece. And as they walked away from the castle, two figures merging into one against the golden light of the dawn, the silence of the library was finally replaced by the music of a life lived together. The ending was not just happy, it was certain. 10 years had passed since the stones of Hogwarts had settled back into place, and the air in the Wiltshire countryside no longer tasted of fear, but of blooming jasmine and ancient, peaceful earth. The Malfoy Manor of Draco's childhood, a cold museum of blood purity and shadowed corridors, was gone, replaced by a home that breathed with light. They had torn down the heavy velvet curtains and unbolted the doors of the cellars, letting the sun scour away the remnants of the past. But the heart of the house was the West Wing. Draco stood at the arched entrance of the grand library he had built for her, leaning against the doorframe just as he used to do in the small cottage in France. The emotional seesaw had long since stilled into a deep, rhythmic harmony. The repulsion was a ghost of a memory. The trust was as natural as breathing. Inside, the room was a cathedral of knowledge. Shelves of dark oak reached toward a domed ceiling, painted not with family trees, but with the constellations they had watched from the astronomy tower. There was no restricted section here. Every book was a bridge, every page a testament to the world they had helped rebuild. Hermione was perched on a sliding ladder, her wild curls pinned up with a silver quill, a gift he had given her on their 5th anniversary. She was humming a soft tune, a melody from Nellie's time capsule that they often played on the enchanted gramophone in the evenings. "You're over-indexing the arithmancy section again, love," Draco called out, his voice rich and full of a warmth that the boy in the library would never have recognized. Hermione turned, her eyes brightening with that familiar, fierce spark. "And you're lingering in the doorway again. Are you coming in, or are you just going to admire the architecture?" "I'm admiring the view," he countered, crossing the room with a grace that was no longer guarded. The approach was effortless now. He reached the ladder and waited for her to climb down. When her feet hit the floor, he didn't give her space. He stepped into her circle, his hands finding the familiar curve of her waist. The warmth between them was a steady, permanent hearth. "The children are with Narcissa in the gardens," he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. "Scorpius is trying to teach Rose how to prune dirigible plums. It's a disaster." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the room. "They're exactly like us, aren't they? One trying to follow the rules, the other trying to rewrite them." "They're better than us," Draco said softly. He took her left hand, tracing the skin of her palm. There were no scars there from the war, only the faint lines of a life lived well. He then glanced down at his own left forearm. The dark mark was nothing more than a faint, silvery blur, a shadow eclipsed by the midday sun. It was no longer a brand. It was a relic of a different lifetime. The conflict of their youth, the blood, the names, the secrets, had been resolved in the most beautiful way possible, through the mundane joy of a quiet afternoon. "Do you remember?" he asked, his gaze drifting to the window. "The first night? The library?" Neither of us said a word. "I remember thinking you looked like you were drowning," she whispered, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. "And I remember deciding that I wasn't going to let the water take you." "You didn't," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the key." The final resolution was not found in a grand speech or a public monument, but in the way he pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of home. It was a slow, lingering kiss, one that carried the weight of 10 years of peace and the promise of 50 more. It was the kiss of two people who had survived the dark and were now masters of the light. Draco pulled back just enough to look into her amber eyes. The doubt was dead. The cold was an impossibility. "I have a secret, Hermione," he murmured, a playful, loving glint in his silver eyes. "Another one, Draco." "Only one," he said, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles. "I think I'm the happiest man in the wizarding world, and I think, for the first time in the history of this name, a Malfoy is exactly where he belongs." Hermione smiled, a soft, radiant expression that made his heart skip a beat. She reached up, pulling his head back down to hers. "That's not a secret, Draco," she whispered against his lips. "Everyone who looks at us knows that." As the sun began to set, casting long, golden bars of light across the thousands of books, they stood together in the center of their sanctuary. The emotional seesaw had reached its final resting place. There was no more repulsion, only the endless, beautiful approach of a life shared. The thorns were gone, the cage was open, and the bird was finally, truly home. They walked out of the library together, the sound of their footsteps echoing a perfect, happy rhythm, leaving the doors open so the light could fill every corner of the house. The end was not just a resolution, it was a beginning.
This story is very special to me. It is not just about magic or war, It is about two people who were lost in the dark. I wanted to show that even a monster can be a boy who just afraid, and I wanted to show that kindness is the strongest power in the world. Hermione did not use a wand to save Draco. She used her heart. She chose to see the human behind the mask. We all have masks. We all have secrets, but we also have the power to draw a key for someone else. I hope this story gave you hope. I hope it reminded you that it's never too late to change your path. Love is not always loud. Sometimes it is just a quiet look across a library shelf. Thank you for listening to my words. Thank you for feeling these emotions with me. Until next time, keep looking for the light. Goodbye.